Hey, this is Tyler Jones, and you're listening to the Element Podcast. All right, what's going on, my woods people? We are here in Sulphur Springs, Texas, on this beautiful Nebraska Furniture Mart couch again. And I think it's probably low 50s outside. It was pretty cloudy all day. And I guess we are about to embark on a really cool episode. What's going on, KC?
Man, it is shorts weather. We both have on our shorts today. I had an old fella tell me these are called stump jumpers at one point in time. Have you ever heard that?
I haven't heard that.
I don't know if I've ever heard that except for that one time. So, but we got on our stump jumpers today, and it feels great. It is fishing weather, but we still have whitetails on the brain.
We do.
And I don't know if I'm ever going to be cured of this sickness.
I was kind of thinking that today. So what I've been doing is sitting at Starbucks, uploading videos to my Vimeo channel, wedding videos, and editing for a little bit the One-Eyed Jack film. And as I'm looking at this is a buck that I shot in 2015 and self-filmed, but I shot him in early December and self-filmed that day, and that was the first day the whole season that I had self-filmed. Prior to that, I had been filmed every day that I had sat in a tree that year, which was a lot. And so I have a lot of really great footage, cool time lapses and stuff like that we got throughout the year. And I'm taking the whole story of the season and trying to condense it down into a very watchable version and hopefully get that out soon. The issue is that we're looking at hopefully being a part of the Full Draw film tour in one way or another. So we've been in correspondence with them, and we think that that's going to happen. You know, things do happen that can mess things up sometimes, but from what we understand, we are going to be a part of that tour in one way or another. So that's exciting news, and I'm putting together a little more, tediously edited version so that, hopefully it looks good and as good as it can be, and it's still short enough to be interesting for our millennial viewership.
The millennials, is that us?
I don't think so. I think we're like Generation Y or X or whatever that was right before them, right?
Maybe. I hope, man. Like, that's such a negative connotation nowadays.
It
but
is.
We saw the new millennium. Do you remember that? Everybody's like freaking out about Y2K and stuff.
Yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah.
I was like in a church that night.
Were y'all like praying about Y2K and stuff?
I don't remember.
I think we
about
got
that.
together instead of prayer. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point we did. I don't know if we were like praying the whole night.
Yeah. But it was like it was a weird deal. Weird time in our lives.
Yeah, dude, it's crazy to think about. Like, people would laugh about that now, probably.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I laugh about it.
Yeah.
It was weird, like people were just like freaking out buying water and generators.
Yeah.
But,
there was. I remember that all the stores were like, had gone out of stock on a lot of things like that, essentials. So
yeah, for sure. Hey, maybe, like it should have happened. You know what I mean? Like if we would have had Y2K, we could have all went back to the land and like lived as the Amish or pilgrims. And then we like could have accomplished our goal of hunting for a living because you had to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like maybe we missed a blessing.
Maybe. I don't know. There's no telling.
Crazy concept.
Yeah. Anyway, so back onto the whitetail game. One thing I do want to do up front here is just introduce our guest. We're going to have Erik Barber on the show today, who is one of the hunters, public land hunters on Midwest Whitetail, who we got to hang out with a couple weeks ago. And that was the first time we had really met him. Super nice guy. Just like you don't typically think of your northern guys when you're a Texas native as being like your most friendly. And this guy is super friendly. So I guess he destroyed the
negative
stereotype in my mind for sure.
Yeah, Erik is a super cool dude, man. I'm pretty excited to talk to him. Like, he's one of those guys who has a little bit of energy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like he's excitable and he like digs talking about this stuff. You know, it's not like, I'll give you 45 minutes of my time and I'll tell you what I know. It's
Right.
like, yeah, dude, let's talk and learn from each other and, go from there. And that's just, in the little bit of time we got to hang out with him, a couple weekends ago, I knew that. So I'm super excited for like an opportunity to actually sit down and break down whitetail with him, with that being the major focus.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the guy seems really knowledgeable, and we'll see, but I'm sure he is. He spends a lot of time with other guys that are knowledgeable. And, man,
Yes.
as you know, just from us two, I mean, I guess as I know, maybe you don't, but, us hanging out the last year or so and studying public land deer as much as we have and just bouncing ideas, man, it's made me smarter for sure, made me a better hunter. So I'm sure he's got a lot of info to offer. So we are definitely looking forward to this. Anything else happening?
Man, not a ton. Just excited to get. Yeah, waiting on fishing. It's time to do that, actually. I'm about to put my vegetables in the garden Saturday, I'm pretty sure.
All right.
Yeah, so I'm pretty pumped about that. I got my list broke down, and we're going to live off the land this year. So
cool. That's the goal, man.
That's the goal. I don't know if we're going to be like completely self-sustainable. Most likely not. But
well, I don't know where you're going to get your bread from.
Yeah, exactly. I don't eat bread. My wife, though, dude, she would be like, oh, if I had to take bread away from my wife, she would be mad at me. But anyways.
What we're going to talk about today here in just a second is we're going to be discussing big woods with Erik, because he grew up in Wisconsin and has some big woods experience, especially on public land. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure he has a lot of ideas that could help us out here in these big oak and pine forests, like Sam Houston and some of these, big woods areas that we have in this eastern part of our state. Mm-hmm. So if you're game for it, man, let's go ahead and get him on the line.
Yeah, man, let's call him up.
Let's do it. Before we begin, I'd like to apologize for the audio. There's a couple little spots where it's iffy. Erik lives way out in the country where big deer grow, and I think you can still understand the points that he's trying to convey. So let's continue. All right, on the line, we have Erik Barber from Midwest Whitetail. What's going on, dude?
Not a whole lot, man. How you guys doing?
We are good. We have good weather here, so all is well in Texas.
That is always a plus. We've been battling some cold stuff here in the Midwest, and it's definitely nice to kind of see a break of spring here.
Are they starting to drop now because of that weather? Or, I mean, when we were up there recently, it seemed like all of them were still holding just about.
I mean, it's still, I actually had a buddy up in Wisconsin send me a picture of a buck on March 9th that was still holding both sides.
Golly.
And that was a pretty big deer, but, it's getting to the point in the season now where they got to be starting to drop soon. It's just got to happen. But we're still not really finding a whole lot.
KC said he lives in like a deer farm pretty much. And he said he saw 2 shed bucks last night here, which I figure they're usually a little bit behind you guys, about a few days or a week or so. But anyway,
it just seems so spotty up here. I mean, Greg and I were actually out shed hunting the other day, and on our way back into the office, we saw a shed buck run across the road. So just seems like it's a real spotty and they're real spread out right now.
Right. Well, cool, man. Let's get into this. What do you think? What do you think about telling us just kind of a backstory about yourself, how you got to where you are, maybe how you got into hunting and stuff like that?
Yeah, definitely. My dad actually got me into hunting when I was about, I think, 8 years old. He, was always telling me deer stories and that kind of stuff. And when I was 9 years old, he took me out for the first time during Wisconsin's gun season. And actually, I'm going to backtrack there. So the first time he took me out was bow season of when I was 9 years old. And I've been playing those little deer hunting video games or whatever that you get on the computer.
Yeah.
And my whole perception of hunting at that point was go out, bring the grunt call and rattle and just do that. And eventually a buck will come in. And we were hunting in northern Wisconsin. I totally had the wrong, perception of it. But lo and behold, I've actually grunted a buck in on my first time that I was out with my dad. And I was kind of just hooked from there. It was just a little 6-pointer, but it came into like 30 yards. And, I was just tore up, shaking like crazy, and kind of been hooked on it since.
Cool.
And then that obviously stayed with me throughout, as soon as I was 12 years old, which is when you're legal to hunt in Wisconsin, I, started going out right away with my dad. And that carried with me all the way through college. And in college, I really started watching Midwest Whitetail, which is what kind of opened up the door for me to see like career opportunities in this field. And I applied for the Midwest Whitetail internship in 2013 and got it. Came down and I was mainly doing back end work, like uploading content to the website. But they also gave me a chance to go out and film some hunts, and I think I filmed three or four buck kills that year. And I had a blast doing that. I learned a lot of the ins and outs of filming hunts and all that stuff, and was lucky enough then to stay on full time. I went back, finished up a semester of school, and returned to full time in January of 2014.
So where was school?
I went to a real small college in southeast Wisconsin called Carroll University.
Mm-hmm.
And the main reason that I ended up going there was my parents, actually, their house was only about half hour, 45 minutes away, and I had a really sweet little spot to hunt right near my parents' house. And I didn't want to go too far away from that. So that played a huge factor into it. And, I think I definitely made the right choice, because I don't know if I would have been able to give up 4 years of deer hunting. And, in Wisconsin, it's kind of hard to find access. So I just didn't want to lose that. And I'm really glad that I, made the decision that I did there.
Yeah, man, if I had it all to do over again, I would go to either Iowa State or Iowa.
Oh yeah. I guess that wouldn't be a bad plan either.
Yeah.
Ever since I moved down to Iowa, it's incredible. Like, guys always think it's another world, and it really is. I mean, I've never seen the amount of deer activity and the kind of habitat that we have around here until I moved here.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you shot a pretty awesome deer in Wisconsin a couple years ago, and I think Zach was on the camera. I may not be right, but did Chantel shoot a deer there like year before or something?
Yep. We got engaged on that hunt, and Chantel and I did, and that was the same spot that Zach and I ended up shooting that buck at.
That's cool. So what makes that spot good? Why that spot? And maybe if you could I know you added a water source there, maybe kind of discuss that as well.
Yeah. I mean, if you guys have seen the hunt, you've kind of seen that property is really one dimensional. It's just all those planted pines that are all in a row. And if you look at that property as a standalone place, it's a pretty poor place to hunt. If you just had that out in the middle of nowhere, I don't think that it would be anywhere near what it is with the surrounding properties that are, bordering it. But it's got about 200 acres to the west that doesn't get hunted, and it's got everything that the deer need up there. There's a lot of bedding. And then it's 36 acres that I hunt there, and that lies real low. It's there's a big ridge from the west that drops down into this pine bottom, and then up to the east, it goes back up to another oak ridge. And it's basically a really good travel corridor for deer, especially late October, early November. Once they start getting into the rut, to kind of cruise from one block of timber to the next by staying secluded, by staying in those pines. And, that was a property that I really grew up deer hunting, and I kind of figured out over years of hunting it that there was a certain area of the property that they seemed to move through more than, other ends of it. And what that all related to was contour of a ridge kind of dropping down, and it was the easiest travel corridor for them to use, staying kind of unseen from anything. So what I did is I brought in just a little kiddie pool, $5 type thing that you can buy at Menards or whatever, and sunk that into the ground and filled it up with water. And looking back on that, what it really did is it created just a focal point and kind of like a hub of deer movement. I had does around that all the time, coming in, drinking out of that pool in daylight, which naturally, especially during late October, which is when I shot that deer with Zach, the bucks were definitely staying close to that because I knew does were frequenting that area. And, like I said, it was just kind of like a little hub of deer activity that really helped me because it was a really one-dimensional piece other than that.
Right. Cool. Well, so the reason, I should have maybe said this earlier. The reason that we really wanted to talk to you is because you have some experience there in what we would consider, or a lot of people do consider, like big woods hunting. We live in East Texas and hunt. Most of the hunting we do is in the eastern half of the state right now. And there's actually, pretty vast expanses of big timber. I want to kind of pick your brain because we haven't had a whole lot of experience actually, being in these vast, like river bottom type, big woods areas. So, if you were to go into a new area and it was a big woods area, whether it be public or a big tract of private, where do you start?
Big woods hunting for me always seemed so overwhelming because when you look at it on the map, and that is always the first place that I start, is looking at, any piece that I get permission on or a new piece of public. I look at an aerial map, and especially with big woods stuff, as you guys know, it's so one-dimensional. It can really overwhelm you because you got just this big expanse of timber, and it's like, well, where the heck do I start? Mm-hmm. And, when I say we, I'm kind of referring to all of us in the office, Aaron, Zach, Greg, and myself, by just kind of scouting these pieces, specifically big timber. The most important thing that I think is getting some good boots on the ground type scouting. You look at it on a map and you maybe kind of figure out what areas are the furthest away from access and that kind of thing. If it's public, so then you identify those areas and you kind of get down and once you're walking a piece, you can kind of see where areas where maybe there's a little bit more sunlight hitting that you wouldn't be able to see on a aerial map, but because that sun is hitting that area, maybe you have a new type of regrowth generation of trees. Mm-hmm. And you can find different areas where deer are feeding on browse and that kind of stuff. So basically what you're looking for there is just any kind of habitat change that breaks up the monotony of a really big chunk of land. And when I relate that for my style of big woods hunting, which has always been northern Wisconsin, I grew up kind of hunting 225,000 acres of a big chunk of public land in northern Wisconsin, which was just huge. Mm-hmm. And for that, my dad and I really focused on, those habitat breaks that are maybe something like a beaver dam, or up there we have something that we call Dogwood Thickets, which is basically that real thick red brush that you might see on the edge of a swamp or something. Mm-hmm. And what makes those really unique is that they're super thick and deer can bed in them, but they'll also browse on those areas. So if you can find, let's say you're looking at an aerial map and you see that there might be a little low area that you maybe suspect holds water during wet years, get in there, do some boots on the ground scouting. And if you can find those little subtle changes, those are definitely the areas that you want to focus on.
It's good advice. When you talk about the Dogwood Thickets, something came to my mind. We're starting to pick up some of our trail cameras for a couple months out of the woods just so they don't get stolen on public and because the deer are losing their horns. But we just picked one up last weekend that has a really good 3-year-old that we've kind of patterned back off of a food source into the woods a little more towards his bedding. And it's right on the edge of what is a cedar elm thicket, and they're starting to bud right now, and we're getting pictures of these deer eating the buds off of these cedar elm trees. So it's kind of the same thing. It's like really small, high stem count area with, but that can be used as kind of like cover / bedding, but also, can be browsed at the same time. So that's kind of interesting how that relates,
Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up high stem count areas, because that's another thing that I kind of forgot to mention is, especially in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, the logging industry is huge up there. So they'll go in and they'll, timber an area, or they'll clear cut an area, And when they do that, you get a lot of those, we call them popple slashings. Just, they're real small trees. They're maybe, once they're maybe a 3 or 4 year old cut, they're maybe only the diameter of your thumb. But they're just stacked in there like crazy. And the same thing there, just like you mentioned, there's a lot of natural browse in those areas, and the deer really kind of stick to those areas. So it's interesting that you brought that up. How it relates to you guys down in Texas is really kind of the same stuff that we look for in northern Wisconsin.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that's why it's interesting to talk to guys like you that are literally across the country from us, or have hunted across the country from where we're kind of used to hunting. It's it seems like there's always things that can relate in deer hunting. So
right,
that's just really interesting to me. KC, what are you thinking, man?
Hey, Eric, how you doing, man?
Pretty good, Casey. How's it going?
Oh, it's going good, man. It's good to talk to you again. Hey, I got a question for you. I grew up hunting big woods pretty much my whole life. Once I graduated from the field edge stage to trying to move in deeper a little bit.
Yep.
And something that's always weighing on my mind is patterning versus tendencies. And what I mean by that is, should I be trying to pattern a specific buck to what he does, or should I be hunting more of like what we feel deer tend to naturally do in big woods areas? Do you see what I'm saying? The difference is?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What do you think?
I've thought about that a lot too, because especially the place that I grew up deer hunting, that little water hole spot that we talked about earlier, there's a lot of timber in that area, and it seems that's a smaller property. It's 36 acres, and I've always kind of noticed that the deer bed in a certain location on that property. And so basically how that relates to what you're getting at is, I might have 3 bucks on trail camera that I'm interested in shooting going into the season. And I can pretty much count on that, once the season opens up, one of those bucks is going to be in one of those established bedding areas that I'm kind of familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'll do is I'll hunt those areas, and, it is definitely a little bit more challenging to pattern a specific deer in big timber. But if you can pick up on a tendency, such as mature bucks bedding in a specific area, like in the case of that property, it's just about a third of the way down a ridge, off a food source. And what I've noticed is, that's the west ridge of this property. And for morning hunts, it really sets up well, because you can slip in there. You're in the bottom, but with it being, pitch black, the deer aren't going to see you slipping in there to hunt them.
Mm-hmm.
And those deer are typically bedded up on that upper third of that ridge with a west wind blowing over the top of them, so they can smell anything that's up in that open field, and they can see anything that's going down, that's, moving, or a potential predator in this bottom. And basically where I'm going with that is, those deer, you can pretty much count on a west wind that there's going to be a buck in that area, or if not, he's going to be coming back to bed in that area. So it's a tendency that I've picked up on that I really like to keep in my back pocket for that time of year. So I guess, my answer to that question would be definitely hunting tendencies. You can figure out an area where a mature buck is bedding, take that to the bank, and just hope that your, scouting is paid off and that he is actually in that area.
It's interesting that you mentioned that and what you're saying right now, because there's several things that, or several people that I've heard say something similar to this, including a guy who I know that's fished the Bassmaster Classic twice, and he fishes. He's a guide here on Lake Fork, right here local to us, and has been for 25 or 30 years. But he talks about it in terms of fish, where I've heard it talked about as well in terms of dominant bucks. But basically, a dominant animal will always utilize like the best habitat, essentially. So if you catch a 10-pound bass off of that stump, this spring, the chances are next spring that there's a good fish in there, then, the next spring are pretty high, because there's something about that spot that makes that animal feel safe and gives it the food cover, and everything that it needs. So, same thing with a buck. Am I wrong? But hasn't Dan Infalt said something along those lines, like that a mature buck, once he's harvested, the next dominant one in line will go sit in that same bed almost, sometimes.
Definitely. And, it's interesting that you brought that up too, because Aaron Warbritton, he shot a buck this year, and him and Zach actually just went back to, kind of backtrack that deer. And there's a bed in that same area where that buck was coming out of, and it looked like it had been being used. So, that definitely, I think that theory definitely holds some weight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we are babies on the whole buck bedding thing, and we're really trying to figure it out down here. And I don't know why, but it's just nothing that, as Texas hunters, we never really considered being a thing. I just always group bedding as one big thing.
Yep.
Not just differentiated between does and bucks. But it makes so much sense when you start breaking it down. They're not going to be bedding together, especially during the rut. And, I've learned a lot from doing some readings off the Hunting Beast and listening to what Dan says. I believe there's one time Dan had said something about killing like 3 or 4 mature bucks over the course of 7 or 8 years out of the same bedding area.
Yeah. It's unbelievable. And I myself, too, am new to that whole theory. I mean, Zach and Aaron they kind of discovered Dan's website, The Hunting Beast, through, I think they did a podcast with a guy named Joe Elzinger, who's a member of that forum and, frequents it a whole lot. And he kind of brought up the whole idea to those guys, and the light bulb went on, which then got them in touch with Dan, which brought it into the Midwest Whitetail office, which consumed everything they did all summer long. and I mean, I thought they were insane at first. I'm like, these guys are out, it's 95 degrees, and they're looking for deer beds? Like, I want to be, sitting, I don't care where they're bedding right now. I want to sit in the air conditioning and hope that they walk into a food plot,
Yeah.
And it's funny, though, because then we got to talking about it, and when the light bulb went on for me is we basically put it this way. You think about every buck that you've killed, and the area that he came from, is, if you can put that into perspective, he probably didn't travel a whole long ways for him to get from A to B, which is where he ended up getting shot.
Mm-hmm.
And when we put it that way, I related everything back to, some of the deer that I've killed. I killed a buck late season last year that definitely held true to that. And the buck that I killed with Zach in Wisconsin, absolutely the same thing. I mean, I totally believe that deer was bedded on that side of the ridge. And, we did some light rattling right away that morning, and I think that's what brought him up out of his bed. And, eventually he came in for a shot. And I think a lot of the cases this year, too, it's some of the success that the guys, Aaron, Zach, and Greg had in hunting public land in Iowa, experienced a lot of that same thing. And that was really what kind of made the light bulb go on for me, is relating all the deer that you shot, thinking about where they possibly could have came from, and you narrow down those areas, and you eliminate a lot of ground then when you think of it in those terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You talk about this Wisconsin hunt that you were successful on, and I know you added a habitat feature there, that being the water feature.
Mm-hmm.
How often does terrain features factor into like stand placement or, hunting locations for you? In big woods,
for that property,
of course.
Yeah, I mean, for that property, it's interesting because, like I said, it's so one-dimensional. But with that said, my stand placement is in direct relation to the neighboring property. There's a big ridge that drops down off this crop field and comes down into basically the lot line where these planted pines meet this oak ridge. And I've kind of figured out through the years, I mean, not through any expert type strategy, just for me screwing it up enough where I finally realized, hey, I need to be over here, because when they come off that ridge, they're walking down the spine of it so they can see on both sides. And, that's the route that they typically travel on. So definitely in that property, that specific stand location, topography, terrain definitely has a lot of influence there. And for me, when the whole terrain thing really became more prevalent is when I moved down here to Iowa. You know, just like you guys know, I mean, you were up here recently, all the nasty ditches and all that stuff. It's really broken terrain.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you can kind of, it's a little bit easier to figure out, in my opinion, you know, how deer are going to walk or work their travel routes around, say, the end of a ditch. You know, let's say you have a really hard, aggressive ditch that's almost impassable coming up from a bottom, and then it stops, and you've kind of got that natural funnel right around the end of that ditch, you know, where it finally turns into some level ground. And, you know, we've used ditches in the past to access stands coming up through the terrain or through the ditch, and then having our stand right at the point of it, or, you know, in between two ditches, or let's say a bench, maybe where two ridges kind of form into a bench. Those are always great spots for deer during the rut, you know, trying to cover ground in a really fast, you know, really quickly. They're going to use that bench going from one ridge to the other as they sit and check for does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I can remember being up there, you know, and covering ground, and you are covering things that look monotonous to you as a human, but when you step back and break it down, there'll be like, you know, 800 yards where there's zero deer sign, and all of a sudden there's 4 nice rubs at the top of this ridge that looks, you know, and otherwise the ridge looks the same as everywhere else. And you're like, okay,
right.
Why did this happen? But then if you go to looking, there's a terrain feature, you know, like a secondary ridge leading off right there, or there's something that tells you why those are there. And those are kind of the things you have to put together to actually start painting a picture.
Right. Definitely. Secondary ridges, I think, are, you know, one thing that I've, you know, kind of been enlightened to a lot this year, just from Zach talking about him so much. You know, just this year during shed season when I'm covering ground, especially in big timber, you know, my dad was actually down here shed hunting with me, I think the weekend before you guys were down.
Oh, man.
And, yeah, so we didn't find anything, you know, needless to say. We put on some serious miles, but one of the places that we walked quite a bit and spent most of our time was that buck nest spot that Aaron and Zach hunted. And it's interesting because that's what really made me think of it when you said, you know, monotonous timber with not much sign. Then all of a sudden you drop down one of those secondary ridges. There's, you know, shredded rubs. There's lots of scrapes, and that's exactly what we found in that spot.
Mm-hmm.
Going down into that big CRP area where they were seeing those deer bedded near that willow. There's sign like crazy coming off those secondary ridges that come off the main ridge that basically parallels that CRP field. So it's, you know, I definitely do think there is something to that.
Yeah. And it's cool to see, you know, the things you hear about and try to learn actually come to fruition whenever you get out there in the field. So, okay, a little side note. Let's get off the deer hunting and kind of stretch into that shed hunting for just a second. Do you find many sheds in the wooded areas like that, or are they usually down in the bottoms?
Our best luck has always seemed to be in those bottom areas, or on edges. You know, like actually CRP has been just killer for us, and it seems this year, and I've kind of heard this from guys that I follow on Instagram or Facebook, that they've been finding more sheds in the timber this year. And if I had to guess, it would probably be because we had such a mild winter this year. You know, the deer seem to have been carrying their antlers a little bit longer than usual, and we have had some stuff starting to bud up a little bit, and maybe that's the reason that these deer are, you know, more spread out. They don't have to rely on that first little clover plot greening up. Instead, they can, you know, focus on natural browse in the woods, and I think that's part of the reason that this year guys are finding more sheds in the timber. But definitely in years past, we've done really well on, you know, in CRP, and then anything that's a southern exposure, you know, that leads down into a bottom like that, we've typically done really well in those areas. But this year that just hasn't been the case. Yeah,
and that's something that we were just new at and didn't know much of anything about. Whenever me and Tyler went up there to shed hunt and scout, like we were just trying to cover as much ground as possible with really no strategy, which was good for us because what always ends up happening, and this is with a lot of serious deer hunters, I think, that you end up just looking at sign and concentrating on finding new stand trees and stuff like that more than looking at the ground looking for sheds, you know, in particularly, especially when you have the chance to hunt that ground sometime in the future.
Oh, absolutely. Yep, definitely.
Yeah. So while I mentioned stand trees there, and that made me think of something. If you're in the big woods, and say you have some terrain feature like a saddle or a secondary ridge or something that you're trying to hunt deer movement across, and there's 37 trees that look exactly the same, how do you pick the one to put the stand in?
Oh man, I mean, and this is one thing that I think kind of relates back to that property that we keep going back to, where I shot that waterhole buck. All those trees in that area are the same exact thing. They're all white pines, and it seems like the branches on them don't start until you're 35 feet off the ground. And I'm not going up that high, so for me, in that spot, it just seemed like it was the easiest move to get. There's basically a fire lane that cuts that property in half that goes north and south. And I raked the path going to that tree specifically because there was kind of a natural opening where I ended up putting that water hole there. But aside from that, one thing you can do in those situations is, and I found this to be real helpful in that situation, is to, cut limbs from other trees, or, if you're on public ground and you can't cut, you can find limbs off the ground, anything on the ground or any kind of natural foliage that you can zip tie to your tree stands to kind of break up your outline a little bit. I think that's huge when you have just one-dimensional trees without a lot of cover. But let's say you're in an area that, maybe like an oak flat where you do have trees that have a little bit more cover. For hanging hunts on public land, this is just something that I kind of figured out almost the hard way this year with, the hunt that I had. But we had a bunch of red oaks that, were pretty gnarly trees, and we ended up settling on the one that just offered us the greatest shot opportunity. And, it's something that doesn't really sound too scientific or anything like that. Basically just looking for areas where you have maybe that 30-yard radius around your tree that you can shoot. Mm-hmm. But when you're doing hanging hunts and you can't cut stuff, that really goes a long way, because if you end up in a spot that just looks great, has a bunch of sign around it, but you can't shoot more than, 5 yards, you're really hurting your chances there. So that's one thing that I did this year during that hunt, is actually just, pick the spot where I had the greatest shot opportunity, and it ended up working out.
So we have oak tree areas, oak flats. We don't have a whole lot of terrain in a lot of our eastern half of Texas. It's kind of just like really gently rolling prairie type stuff. And, in October, when the oak trees have acorns falling, constantly, it's kind of confusing for me on where exactly to hunt, because it's not just like, well, you've got this, 150-yard oak flat. It's more like you've got, 800 acres of oaks. So a lot of times you hear about the like bed to feed pattern that whitetails use, and that's how a lot of guys hunt them and decide what kind of game plan they're going to use. But in the big woods, sometimes you don't have an ag field that they end up at night, so
right.
What are you seeing as far as how the deer feed in the woods and what they're feeding on, and how are you hunting that?
Some of the biggest things that I've seen deer feed on in big woods is just, and this relates a little bit more to northern Wisconsin, because we have up in that area, we have a lot of maple trees. Mm-hmm. And it always seems that there's, it's a very short window in early to mid-October when the maple trees are freshly falling, deer will actually eat those maple leaves. So, that's one thing that it's a very small window, but you can focus on that. Big picture, if you have maple trees that are dropping leaves in that time frame, you can kind of rely on the deer being in that area. But like I said, that's just such a small window of the season. I think part of it too is understanding, and I'm myself am guilty of this, that I don't really understand a lot of the different natural browse options that deer have out there, throughout the season. There might be a type of tree like hedge trees, for example. Aaron's always talked about that deer will eat the leaves from hedge trees right when they're falling, and that always seems to be right around the first to second week in November. So stuff like that. In Wisconsin, we've always focused on any areas that have recently been logged, because you get a lot of sunlight in those areas, and that causes a little bit of new growth, whether that be a young oak tree. Young oak trees are key in that area because the deer will come by and they'll nip the buds, they'll nip the stems off those younger trees, because that's a whole lot more palatable than a lot of the other options that they have at that time of year. Obviously, you can rely on acorns, but like you said, when you have a huge expanse of acorns, how do you narrow down, that one, basically the X, the spot that you want to focus on? And that is extremely tough. But those are just the things that I've seen, hedge leaves, maple leaves, and, oak regeneration.
Mm-hmm. It's funny you mentioned the X because I think I remember that you're a waterfowl hunter as well. Is that correct?
Well, I've gone on a few hunts with my buddy John here. He's got a northern flight show, so I've been on a bunch of road shows with him.
Yeah.
I would not call myself an expert waterfowl hunter, but I've been on enough that have gone wrong to maybe have an idea of what.
Yeah. Well, I'm
right.
sure if you've been a little bit, that like being on the X, is what you call it, where, sometimes ducks just want to land in this one spot, for no particular reason that you can tell. And if you can start adding up the different factors to figure out where the X is, you can be successful. You talked about the maple leaves, and I found that very intriguing. We have 0 maples in the state of Texas, pretty much, except for like a few little pockets where they don't even belong, but they live there because of certain strange climates. But anyways, Texas is a big state. We have what we call sweet gums in East Texas, and they're really similar to a maple.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder if that might not be something to explore, for me and you, Tyler.
Yeah.
To
Definitely.
see if, they're not even a maple, but they have a star-like leaf like that, and they look like a maple tree. So I don't know, something kind of maybe for us to kind of key on, in the future.
Sure. That's something that's, like I said, it's such a short little window there, but if you can predict what that sign is going to be hot and you can be in that area, that might be all it takes to narrow down a giant area into maybe a little, especially if they're not something that's widespread. That might help you narrow down 800 acres into 5 acres.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's kind of getting towards a point or an idea that I wanted to ask you what your opinion is. We always tend to think of deer in a 24-hour period, bed, food, and water. And in the rut, that kind of gets screwed up a little bit whenever they're chasing. But, essentially, that's what a deer's life is. But I've kind of wondered and think it has caused us problems in the past to where when you get in these big woods areas, deer might just be wanderers, and they don't do things on a 24-hour pattern. They might be gone for a week and then end up back in this same area, 10 days later or something, and it's kind of led me to hunting areas where that's not a possibility, where you look on a big map and you go to the funnels or the transition areas where, of course we know that deer exist, but we also know that big deer live deep in the big middle of the woods here because, there's these 8,000 acre plots that are nothing but trees, and we know deer have to live in there, so like, how do you think you hunt deer who maybe are on a more of a wandering pattern than a daily pattern?
I definitely think that holds a lot of weight because my dad actually has been running a trail camera in a specific area in northern Wisconsin. I don't know how many thousands of acres this continuous block is that he hunts, but he's ran a trail camera for, I think this is going to be the 4th year now. This coming year will be the 4th year that he's ran this trail camera on this secluded little, pine island in the middle, giant, expansive, tamarack marsh or swamp, real low ground. And you got some big ridges that drop into this, but they're, 300 to 500 yards away from this island. It's right smack in the middle. And he kind of decided to run a trail camera in that area because it's the one high point in this real monotonous swamp. And he's had this buck. If he gets him this year, this will be the 4th year in a row, which for that area is, just unbelievable. And he's not a high scoring deer at all, but he's just a really cool, Last year he was a 10-pointer, but that deer actually he's had on that island very sporadically. He'd get him there right around the time that they shed their velvet, and then he would get them there a few times during the rut, kind of when they're more, like you said, the movement is much more sporadic and random. But this year, he decided to hunt a different area that's probably about, I think it's, just over 2 miles away from that island. And he went in there, he hung the stand in the morning and then hunted it that afternoon. And that, lo and behold, the first time he's ever seen that buck, it showed up in the middle of this giant, river bottom area. And like I said, that's almost 2 miles away from that island. And, the same thing we ended up experiencing back in 2013, the year that I interned at Midwest Whitetail. I actually missed a buck, giant buck on a hunt that, I filmed Aaron Warbritton on, and we were having a terrible year in 2013. He shot, this real nice 8-pointer, probably 3-year-old buck, and it was real early, like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We switched. We were seeing bucks like crazy, so we switched in the stands, and at last light, I had just this giant come in about 30 yards and took a shot at him and deflected off a tree at the last minute. But and I still, have nightmares about that. But where I'm going with that is that's a very big woods area. I don't know how many acres of timber that exactly is, but the following year, 2 of the interns actually got trail cam pictures of that deer, which would have been 4 miles to the west of where I missed him. And
wow.
then that August, Aaron was going in, and this is really close to that buck nest area. He was actually driving in to scout that area for the first time and found that deer's shed in August hanging in a cedar tree about 5 feet off the road. And, he thought he was being set up. I mean, the thing it's a giant antler. It's got to be every bit of 90 inches. It's got,
gosh.
It's got, I think, 9 points. It's got a triple brow tine, just crazy looking thing. But so now where that antler was found was 6 miles, I believe, to the west of where I missed that deer. And it is, 1,000%, the same deer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting that deer traveled that much ground. And same case with my dad in northern Wisconsin. So in my opinion, big woods deer are definitely way more travelers than deer in crop country. They got their little blocks of timber. They maybe got an island out in the middle of a standing cornfield that they're going to spend time in.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, deer that are in the big woods are just going to be traveling so much. And it's hard to really narrow them down. But I think, like we've done this throughout all of this, is it goes back to those known bedding areas where a mature buck is going to be holed up in. And if you can focus on those areas, I think those are your best tie-on spots to intercept them.
So do you have a hypothesis as to why that buck ended up 6 miles away? You think it was because he got spooked, or do you think that he is just that much of a roamer?
My best guess would be, because it's interesting, the trail cam pictures which were the only trail cam pictures they got him in 2014. It was one sequence, and it was right around Thanksgiving, so it was late November, and he was with a doe. So that's all I can think of, is that maybe he was following a doe or chased the doe into that area. But for him to then also drop his antler close to that area tells me that it wasn't that random of a thing.
Right.
I really do think that he must have just been that much of a roamer.
Mm-hmm.
And which is crazy because, he was, like I said, he was a mature, old, giant antler deer. And those typically aren't the deer that you would associate with being, a roamer in an area that big. But I definitely think he was. Yeah.
Well, since we've kind of hopped into it, tell us a story about the buck you killed in Iowa last year.
Yeah. So this year, or last year, actually, in 2015, that was the first year that I moved to Iowa and spent full time here. And the property that, our rental house actually sits on 115 acres. and it's majority cropland, and that's really my sweet spot that I kind of focus on most of the season. You know, I got a few different food plots and a few different stand sets back here that's kind of my ace in the pocket. But it really sets up mostly for westerly, northwesterly, and north winds. And on that day, it was October 21st, we had a southeast wind that day. And it was a really good day, really high pressure day after a lot of real stagnant, just the barometric pressure maybe kind of hovered around like that 28 range, 27 range. And then all of a sudden it was up around 31 that day. And it wasn't necessarily the front end of it was the front end of a cold front, but it wasn't necessarily the first cold day. The first cold day would have been the following day, but this was the climb and barometric pressure. So I really wanted to be out in the woods. And we always, at Midwest Whitetail, the guys in the office that hunt the public land, we kind of work as a team. And I had kayaked actually in the summer, this area that we ended up going to. And I brought it up to Aaron and Greg. Greg had hunted the north side of this piece. And I didn't think that anyone had ever really set foot on that south end of this little cove. So I talked with Aaron and Greg, and they're like, yeah, there's probably a pretty good spot that no one's really checked out on that south end. It'd be something worth diving into. So we did a hanging hunt there that day, and actually everything that could have went wrong. We got set up in a tree that once I got the hunter stand hung in, I knew I wasn't going to be able to get the camera stand in. So we tore it down, and I actually told my buddy who was filming me, I'm like, let's get out of here. We're just going to blow it up if we don't do anything. He's like, well, it was 4:30 at that point, so he said, you might as well just get set up. We'll see what happens. So we got set up in an oak tree. We had a pretty good radius around us that we could cover, and we could see quite a bit of ground for that time of year with all the leaves on the tree, and we could still see a decent amount. So it'd be a good observation sit. And at last light, actually, this buck came in from which would have been downwind. I mean, he came up the same way that we walked in. And as he was coming in, I really didn't get that good of a look at him, but I could see he was a decent buck. And as soon as I realized that he was at least a 3-year-old deer, I figured he was going to get our wind and be gone. But he walked right through it. And then I realized that he was a really nice buck, big 10-pointer, tall tines. And, right away then I knew that it was a deer that I wanted to shoot. And I stopped him at about 30 yards and made the shot, but I hit that basically right where his leg bone comes into his shoulder, so low and forward. Where if it would have been maybe about 2 to 3 inches back, I probably would have heart shot him and he would have been done.
Right.
But I broke that front right leg, and long story short, we stayed on him all night that night, tracked him till 4 in the morning. And actually bumped him out of his bed and decided to come back at first light, came back and tracked him until about noon the next day when we finally snuck up to him in his bed. And he was bedded in the middle of this cove of, like a dogwood thicket, actually, that red brush that kind of is along the border of the, with the water being down, we had all that red brush there, and that's exactly where he was bedded. And I got a second arrow in him, but all I could see was, the top of his antlers. I just knew I had to make the shot. And long story short, we tracked him all night that night, all day the next day, and eventually lost blood. We had gone right at about 3 miles at that point from the original shot.
Wow.
And blood was non-existent, so we called it. And then 6 days later, from 6 days after the original shot, I got a Facebook message from a guy that said, hey, if you're the guy that hit that really big buck down by, this area, I got some good news. Fishermen actually found him. He's laying right off the coast of the water, or the beach of the water.
That's crazy.
So I was freaking out. I went down there, and sure enough, it was the same deer. And I just couldn't have been more excited. It was obviously really bittersweet. The entire deer went to waste as far as the meat goes. And, that's the reason all of us hunt is, we're not hunting for antlers, we're hunting for meat. So it was a failed hunt in my opinion, but at the same time, it was something that I learned a lot from, and guys do that all the time and they never get the closure that I got. So I feel just extremely fortunate to have that.
Yeah, man, I watched the whole video, and it's an incredible story.
Yeah.
I guess, have you ever had any history? Have you ever seen him on a trail camera or anything?
Nope. It was the first time we saw him, and it was the first time we hunted that area. Had no idea what was really in that area, and that's what walked past us.
Yeah, that kind of puts a little more proof, as if you need it, that the first time into an area can be the best a lot of times,
Definitely.
It also put some proof in the fact that Iowa is amazing and awesome,
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. I mean, I do not think that ever would have been possible, in Wisconsin. Let's pick a section of public and, oh, look, here's a giant buck.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't work that way in many other places.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so, I guess we'll try to start wrapping this up, and, we really appreciate your time and everything, but I had a question for you that I wanted to ask, that I asked Zach, and we'll ask him when we do a podcast with him, but how do you guys decide who hunts these public land bucks? As I see it, and the way Zach kind of said, is that, like, there's not really any animosity there between you guys. It seems like you guys have a good system.
Yep. I think the way, I'm obviously biased, but I think the way that, we as a group of guys in the office do deer hunting is some of the most fun and I think everyone in that office would vouch for that it's the most fun that they've had deer hunting in their entire life. We work as a team. We'll go and we'll scout areas, and we never withhold information from one another. We'll tell, Zach or Aaron, whoever, what we found in that spot. And then we automatically, as a group, kind of start picking that area apart. And it's a lot of fun, and it makes us way more effective.
Mm-hmm.
As you guys know, with you guys hunting together,
Mm-hmm.
that makes it easier for you guys to, bounce ideas off one another and
Mm-hmm.
maybe realize something that you wouldn't have otherwise if it was just, you guys doing it on an individual basis. And really, if whoever's got a tag at that point, I know in one instance this year, so John and I, another guy that I work with here, we scouted an area for ducks that morning, and it was an area that we had to walk in, and we saw a bunch of bucks, no ducks, just a bunch of deer. Came back, told the guys, and then that afternoon, Aaron and Zach went down and scouted that area, and they saw a really nice buck. This was, I think, on November 1st, and then the next day, Greg went in and hunted that area because, Zach wanted to go into a spot that was deeper. Zach's the wild man. He wants to get as deep and as far away from human civilization as he can get.
Yeah.
And the spot where they knew this deer was kind of hanging out was real close to the road. So he's like, well, Greg, you should go there. I'm going to push way in. And lo and behold, Greg killed the deer. We love doing it as a team. No matter who shoots the deer, it's a victory for all of us because, hey, that's another tag out of the way. That's the way that we kind of like it, and it's just been a blast.
Yeah, man, it's awesome to see y'all have the team mentality. Me and Tyler haven't hunted together for forever, but this past season and this year of scouting has gone really well because we complement each other. Not like, hey, man, you're doing a good job, but like, okay, so I'm very analytical and Tyler's very big picture, and those two things mesh together very well. And I can only imagine an office full of 4 or 5 guys that you all have these specific talents, and it probably is what helps lead y'all to be so successful. That you all are applying your different ways of thinking about things and coming up with a big idea and a way to, harvest deer.
Right, definitely. I mean, and that has helped us so much. And, I'm really thankful because in deer hunting, as you guys know, it's a very reclusive sport. A lot of guys, they want their one farm for themselves, and, that's fine. I mean, we have no qualms with that at all, but it's for us, it's just so much more fun for us to all get together and say, okay, hey, let's go kill some bucks.
Heck
And,
yeah.
You know, it's been a blast.
Yeah, it's awesome how it seems like y'all have the deer camp mentality 24/7 at Midwest, and it comes over well, you know, through content. Okay, so we started this conversation big picture and really broke down in some fine details and tactics. And dude, you've done a great job, and thank you so much for what you've taught us.
Yep.
No problem.
So let's go big picture again here to kind of wrap it up. How did growing up in Wisconsin and hunting big woods your whole life, how do you take those tactics now living in Iowa and apply them? And then, like, how has it helped you? Like, and, you know, I know there's probably a plethora of ways, but, you know, give us a good example.
The biggest thing for me coming from Wisconsin, you know, is an area where you might pick an area and it's just, like we've talked about, very monotonous. And you're looking for those super subtle features and, you know, like maybe a little knob out, you know, out in the middle of a swamp or something like that. You're looking for something very subtle, whereas down here you might have something that's much more aggressive. Like in one instance, let's say you have a ditch that comes up and ends, you know, right with a block of timber that you then have maybe 40 yards or whatever, then to the edge of the cornfield. You know that's going to be a really good pinch point. So growing up in an area that's been so one-dimensional has, I think, really helped me to have that eye for kind of, you know, more, you know, terrain. Obviously down here, the terrain changes are just so aggressive, and it's almost overwhelming, you know, coming from an area where you just don't have ditches and you don't have these, you know, giant ridges, that, you know, it definitely helped me. And I guess I would say just, you know, the type of terrain down here is a little bit easier to focus in on as opposed to like areas where you guys are at, or, you know, northern Wisconsin, or, you know, these big giant blocks where you have more aggressive terrain. Like here in Iowa, it's just a lot easier to predict deer movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's cool, man. I can definitely see, you know, just from our experience in Iowa, how, you know, being down here looking for needles and haystacks, and then you go to Iowa and like, oh my gosh, you know, look at all this sign. Oh my goodness, it's a transition zone right here, you know.
Yeah.
And it's almost dumbfounding how much sign there is, and then there creates new problems with sorting through it.
Right.
So I got let's say 2 more questions for you, and they're a little bit more lighthearted. First,
Okay.
what does the letters YALL spell?
Y'all.
Good job, man. No, I'm just giving you a hard time. You know, me and you have talked previously, and I have a lot of relatives in Minnesota, so it's good to talk to a guy. He kind of reminds me of my family from up there.
Yeah.
But you did good. That's a good pronunciation there. All right, question number 2. I always ask everyone, you know, you mentioned earlier that first and foremost, you hunt for sustenance. You know, you're trying to put food on the table. And that's kind of how, you know, I like to look at it. We all definitely enjoy large bucks and the challenge of hunting mature deer. But at the end of the day, we want to put good, healthy food on the table for our families. So what's your favorite wild game meal?
My favorite would have to be venison steaks and a cast iron skillet. I mean, it's probably the most simple meal out there, but venison steaks and a cast iron skillet with, you know, some fried onions in there, some butter, and salt and pepper on top. I mean, that's the first wild game meal my dad ever cooked me. And I don't know if that's the reason why, but it's my favorite by far.
Oh, yeah. It's delicious. And that's, you know, comfort food. And, you know, I've polled quite a few people on this, and it all seems to kind of direct that way. No one's ever like, oh, I like this really fancy French blah, blah, blah. You know, they're always like that good, buttery, comfort home food that's simple but so elegant at the same time. So that's cool. And now I'm hungry.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool, man. Well, we appreciate it a lot. This has been super educational for me, I know, and I'm sure for KC and everybody who might listen to this. So we appreciate
no problem,
your time.
guys. I had a blast talking with you.
Well, I'll let you know if I draw a tag, and you know, be hitting you up for spots, I'm sure.
Definitely let us know. I mean, hey, you heard it here. We got the team mentality, so come jump on the bandwagon. You might as well.
Don't tell too many people that, huh?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. No, I'll let you guys know, man, and I look forward to seeing you again, and hopefully we can do this again about a different subject someday soon.
Definitely. Man. Absolutely. I'd love to.
Cool. Well, we appreciate it, and we'll be talking to you soon.
All righty. Good talking to you guys.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, we'll see you.
That was a lot of good information, man. I mean, I learned a lot myself. I mean, if nothing else, which there was something else, but like I got a lot of things that were just running through my mind, and all the questions that I typically have that are just like, and I thought it was this way, but when he says it, it kind of solidifies that maybe where there's two saying the same thing, that it's right.
You know what I like about Eric too is he doesn't speak in absolutes.
Yes.
A lot of the guys you listen to are know-it-alls in their field. They know what they're talking about. And Eric is humble and does know a lot, but he's very similar to us, to where that he just wants to bounce ideas off of people and learn and help other people at the same time.
That's that team member mentality,
Yeah, I love it, man.
Yeah. And I mean, you're right, man. We've talked about this off air, but there are a lot of guys in this community, I guess, or industry, whichever you'd rather call it, that, tend to talk in those absolutes when in actuality you really can't ever tell exactly what a whitetail buck is going to do, And so, I mean, none of them are our guests. Our guests, we only bring on the coolest.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, but anyway.
Some of them are the coolest guys you ever met.
Yeah. One of them in particular. We're going to go fly fishing with him soon.
Yeah, it's happening.
I think it should happen. Anyway, we posted a picture of Teenager. And I guess I could link to that picture in this episode, but really we talked about him in the bonus episode that released recently. So we can, I'll make sure and have that link in maybe both episodes. But anyway, if you want to see Teenager, there's a really terrible Photoshop edit of him, and it actually makes him look smaller. I think it's because he's on top of a mountain, but
yeah. I think he's in British Columbia in that one.
He is in British Columbia. Cool. It's crazy.
Is he in there with some stone sheep?
He actually is.
I thought he was.
Yep. There's some ewes on the side of the mountain there with him. I don't know what he's doing. He's a little out of place, but
kind of crazy.
He's a roamer, like we talked about in the episode.
Yeah, dude. He's just a teenager. He's just out roaming all around.
1,200 miles away. Anyway, so that's that. I wanted to also kind of mention this, but you mentioned the sweet gum thing versus the maple when we were talking about them. And from what I understand, like when those, I'm not exactly sure if I'm using the correct terminology, but like the photosynthesis, I guess, ends, and that's when, because the day length gets shorter, that's when the leaves turn colors. So those leaves, the sweet gums turn like as bright as any.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
They're yellow and
that's
red,
why they're so. I think they're similar to maples.
Right.
Maples do the same thing. They have the same shape and leaf, and I mean they're called a sweet gum. They actually, being a dumb little kid, I actually chewed on a leaf one time just to see if it was sweet, and it had a little sweetness.
Okay, so that was my point.
Yeah.
I think that from what I understand, that when that starts to happen, the length of the day breaks down, like. That there's actually sugar buildup inside those leaves, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, it does make sense that if they were to fall, that for a brief period there, that they would taste pretty good to a deer. Might be something worth exploring, man.
Yeah,
putting a trail camera up or something.
Yeah,
I know, like south of here, not far, like on the south end of the lake, there are a ton of sweet gums down that way.
You've seen the mature buck that my dad killed behind our old house place, and that was in a sweet gum thicket. And we had deer all over that place, and it was a little 30-acre property. And I wonder if there's some correlation.
See, it's weird because I haven't always, but I've done a couple of different research stints, really brief, but on sweet gums, and everything I hear about as far as from a deer standpoint, they're worthless. But if they're not worthless for 1 week of the year and they're worthless for 51 weeks, there's a lot of people that would put, they're just worthless, So, I mean, there's a point to be considered. I think we should definitely do some research on that.
Yeah, we will get out and do a little boots on the ground on that and report back.
Yes, October. Yep. Really, it was like December around here last year, I think.
You never know.
I mean,
winter is sometime between July and June in Texas.
and it may not be very long at all.
Yeah, it might not be.
So anyway, that was one point I had kind of was thinking about that we didn't really have time to talk about. But also I was thinking, remember when we talked about the first sit with Erik in his buck this year in Iowa, just to kind of like continue to just hit on this. But Greg shot his buck on the first sit too.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying? The one he was talking about that they have a video of. So man, there's a lot of deer that have been shot on first sits. Didn't Erik or Aaron shoot?
Aaron shot a deer on the first sit this year.
There we go.
Yeah,
like
man.
there's something to it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But I listened to another guy from Midwest Whitetail on a podcast today, actually, because I'm trying to gain any information I can, and he the value of the first sit is like definitely something in his mind, but at the same time, he said that if the wind is right for that spot, I'll sit it 6 days in a row, and I'm sure that he's killed deer on the 6th day there. And I have experience with Jack in 2015. I set that spot like pretty much 5 days in a row, and on the 5th day got him. And I actually had seen him, and he spooked like the 3rd day.
Yeah, I mean, and think about this too from the 2016 season here in Texas. The day I shot at Scar, it was probably like our 11th hunt in that stand. You know, I mean, we spread it out over 2 months, but still, like the first sit is valuable, but at the same time, like
if the wind's right,
and with a trickle rut like we have, anything can happen any day.
Right, especially if you take your time getting in and do it the right way, and don't spook things going in and out. You know, so. Anyway, just a couple of points I had thought about, but that was a very interesting conversation. I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Make sure you guys are giving us reviews on iTunes if you are liking what you're hearing, because that is just super helpful for us. It helps us to be optimized when people search us so that they can also find this good information. And if you want to keep this good information yourself, then you are not embracing the Midwest Whitetail / element mentality of teamwork here. Thank you so much for all your support and your reviews. As far as links go, we will link to Erik's Wisconsin buck video and his Iowa buck from this year. We'll link those in the podcast notes here below, as well as we'll go ahead and put the Iowa scouting trip that we did a couple weeks ago. That little video, we'll link to that in case you haven't seen it yet. And then I want to link to your blog post about the deadhead. Casey's kind of going to start blogging, I think, on our Facebook a little bit, which is very, very cool. He's a heck of a writer. And until we get,
Thanks, man.
Yeah, and until we get our website up and going, it's a good place to blog. And even after that, it would be a great place to just post blogs. So we're probably going to kind of keep that going.
Yeah. And look forward to some other future content. All I'm going to say is you're going to gobble it up.
Ooh. I hadn't thought about that in the last couple hours, but yeah. So anyway, thanks again for your reviews, those of you that have done it, and if you haven't, make sure to do that on iTunes. And man, we really are enjoying the numbers, seeing the numbers trend upward. So God bless you guys. I hope you guys have a great week. Get out in your element as much as you can, and we'll see you soon.